I'm Lydia and I'm the farm director at KC Farm School. This is my 11th season of food production, and I actually started here on this land when Cultivate KC was farming here, and I was an apprentice, worked with other growing growers apprentices, and got started learning all that I didn't know. Since then, I've farmed in New York City, in the Mahakanatuck or the Hudson Valley of New York, and in Australia, outside of Melbourne. And now I've been back here. This is my third season back here. I was managing Gibbs Road, and now I'm helping to cultivate our 11 acres common ground. I am a diversified vegetable farmer, and I use no-till production methods. I've done mostly certified organic production and still use those practices. And I'm learning ever more about regenerative agriculture and a more indigenous way of doing food production that focuses on native ecosystem.
Okay. Hey, my name is Anna Arnott, and I am farm manager here at KC Farm School at Gibbs Road. And I first got into farming through a love of food. I had been in the restaurant industry for a really long time, and I was just really fascinated by different ingredients and how they went together. And I had the opportunity through a contact in the restaurant industry to begin farming. And I was so excited about that because our produce went directly to the restaurant that person opened. So I got to not only feed the community in a market setting, but also in a restaurant setting. And I got to bring my harvest to the restaurant every day and watch people sitting down, having lunch and enjoying the stuff that we worked so hard to grow. And I was just hooked from there. I've kept doing it ever since then, and yeah, the food is the motivation for me.
Okay, so one of the ways we were just talking about keeping the microbiology intact, and the number one thing you want to do is not let that dry out. So we are an oak savanna. This soil was not used to being uncovered. The way that it was tilled before for thousands of years and the way that it evolved with its ecosystem was with the buffalo migrating. So a few times a year they would migrate back and forth, but in the meantime they would be eating, pooping, building up that topsoil. So that tillage was never a full drying out. It was coming with an entire ecosystem of all of the other critters, mammals, birds, all the plants that came with it. So we're obviously far away from that time, and we're not going to be able to mimic that exactly, but some things that we can do is through not tilling the soil, so not letting it dry out. And then when we do till it, we're going to bring in ruminants. We're going to let the chickens scratch in here. And then along with all of that complexity, you have to consider food safety if you're doing food production, right? So we have a vegetable compost that's finished, and we use that to mulch the top of the beds. So this looks like soil, right? But only the places like there that are a little exposed. This is actually covered with compost. Okay. And so what you can see is that there's just one line of drip tape down the middle, but even though it's been hot today, even though it's dry, when I dig down in here, if you stick your hand in there, you can feel that it's still moist.
Yes, it is.
Right? And closer to the plant, I don't want to take the root out, but closer to the plant, you can actually stick your hand down in there and it's really nice and wet.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, so that's something that I encourage all home gardeners to do. Is maybe you start with a till to get your ground kicked back up into production, but then I would suggest doing whatever no-till system works for you. So we mulch with compost here, but then you can mulch with straw, you can mulch with leaves, you can mulch with grass clippings. On the paths here, you can see this path here has been mulched with wood chips, and the same is holding moisture under there. It's got cardboard and then wood chips, and we don't need as much moisture in the paths, right? But because of that microbiology, that fungal activity, the fungi that's here is actually communicating with the plants here.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's why this entire under the ground here is an ecosystem. and then we've got this ecosystem. It's feeding what we see up here. So we want to give that as much comfort, cozy as possible.
Okay. So bed prep is one of the really important parts of no-till because it's how everything gets started. At this point in the process, we've just removed weeds from the surface and a little bit under the surface with a wheel hoe. Now the next step is to remove any of the leaf material and detritus from the bed itself. That'll get any of those little seeds off the top of the soil. So we start with a really clean surface, and then we will add soil amendments, a little bit of compost on top of that, and then we'll plant into that. So there's layers on top of the weeds that we've already removed. So if there's something even deeper, it's got that suppression on top of it too when we start this planting.
Farmer Geek Out. Several days ago, me and our growing growers apprentice did a slate test, which is where you take, you dig down a little bit into, not too far, still in your topsoil, and take a little chunk and then put it in water and see how well it sticks together based on your microbiome, your soil structure, and we have exciting. So this is after several days. You can see the differences. So this is from the West Bottoms area that has been dug with potato forks, and we've been working on getting back into active production the last several seasons. This is from our OG no-till, which was a little surprising, but I'll talk about that. And then this is from our native plant garden. So just noting the differences, right? This is completely fallen apart. It's like created a lot of dust in the water. This is somewhat stuck together, but has fallen apart. And look at this one. It stayed together completely. So they all used to be covered with water. So you want your soil to be staying intact. You want the critters that we can see to be moving through, creating little highways, little hallways in there for air and nutrients to move. But you want that, it's like a glue holding it together for all of those nutrients to stay put because of bacteria, because of fungi. And so when it stays together like the native plant garden one did, it means that your soil is more resilient to both drought and to flooding, because it can withstand the onslaught or like the withdrawal because it's got its own ecosystem going on over. And this one from our OG no-till section, which was the first one to get put into lasagna gardening 4 seasons ago, I was surprised. I think part of the reason that it is so broken apart is because it's just from that first couple of inches, and we cultivate that quite often because that's where we're planting. And then also I think I didn't dig down as deep as with the other ones because I am so used to not disturbing the beds there. But yeah, you can just see the difference of, like, even if you cultivate the top inches to get your seeds germinated or to get your transplants in, this is the soil that you want those roots to be going through, because that's going to give them the best resiliency to those extreme conditions and the best access to all those nutrients that they need to be strong. So we've got some actions to take even in our no-till sections, but this was really exciting. Let me know if you have questions. So here's an example of our no-till method, and there are lots of different methods that farmers use. The one that we use here is a deep compost mulch, and it's a veggie-based compost. Eventually we'll have some manure-based compost as well. So our minimal amount of fertilizer, which is usually feather meal and a combination of the big three, the NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, goes into the soil. And then we come back through and we cover the bed with a thin or thick, depending on what crop's going in, layer of compost mulch. And you can see that right here. This isn't the soil that's exposed, this is actually the mulch. So then once that gets watered, if I reach underneath here, yeah, it's quite wet, and the roots can get down to that. So it keeps the moisture underneath there, and then also helps to suppress the weeds. And then this is our mulching technique for the pathways, we do lasagna mulching with cardboard and then leaves that we have through a partner of ours. And that helps also to maintain the moisture, because we know mycelium and bacteria, if they're happy here, they can help with the growth of the plants and the crop that we want in the bed. Some other parts of this technique are that we work really hard to not compact the beds so we don't step in them. Of course, it's mostly human powered, so we're not having machines go over them. And then when we're pulling things out of the bed, for the most part, we're leaving as much of that root system intact, and more just clipping or pulling out just the top layer, so that all of that microbiome can still maintain all of its moisture, all of its activity. We try to leave the soil covered and get something in the ground as much as possible so that they can always have food access.
So tarping is another tool that we can use for weed management in a no-till system. It allows us to sort of melt everything under there that we don't want to keep growing and forming seeds to drop into our soil. And that stuff we can also use as a green mulch once the tarp kind of suffocates it. We can pull it back up, use that stuff as a green mulch, and the soil hasn't been compacted in any way. All that nice fungal activity, all those little bugs under there, all those little worms under there are all still doing their thing. It's just that the weeds on top of the soil are not. So this is the tarp that we're using here. Other folks have clear plastic tarps that they use. If you wanted to replicate something like this in a home setting, something that you might use would be like a shower liner from the dollar store. Would be a pretty accessible option to just cover that up, get your weeds killed pretty quickly, and start fresh in your soil. So this is our rhubarb bed. We have planted perennials every 50 feet on this farm, and we do that for a couple of reasons. One of which is water management. If you've got something that's always planted every 50 feet and maybe a couple beds on either side that don't have stuff, you're less likely to have runoff of good soil material and water resources that way. And we have taken an approach to weed suppression in this particular bed that we don't do in all of our beds. We put down cardboard and then wood chips on top. And in order to prevent the nitrogen from being locked in our soil, we also included Johnson Sioux compost, which has really high fungal activity, and that should help the mycelial network in the soil and in the compost process the carbon in these wood chips so that the nitrogen in our soil is not locked up by our weed suppression method.